Welcome back to part 2 of our discussion of Eric Rohmer's Comedies and Proverbs cycle. In part 1, we looked at the first 3 films of the cycle, The Aviator's Wife, A Good Marriage, and Pauline at the Beach. And we saw how each of these 3 films built and expanded on the same central conflict of love and relationships between men and women. And we saw the same scenario played out in different ways with escalating scenarios and resolutions. In a way, they will work perfectly as a trilogy in their own right. However, as we spoke about earlier, Rohmer's cinema is one of contradiction, one of dialectics. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Each of the first 3 films had this inherent dialectic within them. As we talked about a dialectic of love, a dialectic of obsession, a dialectic of men and women and if their relationships can actually work. However, it is not until the second half of this cycle that the films start to directly contradict and be the antithesis to the previous films. Full Moon in Paris is the antithesis to A Good Marriage, and The Green Ray is the antithesis to Pauline at the Beach, and in a way even the entire series. And with that, clearing the way to the possibility of an actual synthesis, a resolution, in the final of the 6 films, My Girlfriend's Boyfriend. But that's all getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. Adam, Clement, and Tobias are all back to break down the final 3 films of the cycle. Say hi, guys.
All right, hi everyone. Happy to be back to discuss the rest of the series, especially as The Green Ray is my favorite film from it.
Hey guys, I'm Clem. I'm very happy to be back to discuss the rest of the cycle with you.
Hey, I'm Tobias. I'm also very happy to be back, and The Green Ray is actually my favorite film of all time, so that'll be an interesting discussion.
Yes, The Green Ray is absolutely fantastic, but that's again getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. So, the first of the last half of the cycle is, of course, Full Moon in Paris. And again, we explore the exact opposite of the scenario from A Good Marriage. Louise, our lead, already has a home in a suburb outside of Paris. She has a loving partner who wants her and her only, but it is suffocating her. She needs to breathe, and because of this, she resurrects her bachelorette apartment in Paris. And she needs Paris. She needs her independence. She needs her friends. She needs her career prospect and her individuality. The proverb is, he who has 2 women loses his soul. He who has 2 houses loses his mind. My first reaction to this proverb was, okay, I mean, this is the longest and most complicated yet. And complicated even more by the fact that it is a he that seems to be the subject of all this. Luckily, we had our own Frenchman, Clement, at hand.
Thank you, Chris, for this nice introduction. The original sentence is Qui a 2 femmes perd son âme, qui a 2 maisons perd la raison. The strange thing is that qui in French is not he, it means whoever. So technically, more correct translation for me would be whoever has 2 wives or 2 women loses his soul, and whoever has 2 houses loses reason. Well, obviously, the 2 woman part can be seen as we're having 2 lovers, which we'll discuss later because, well, let's say that the film has something to do with 2 men or maybe even more, who knows?
It's an interesting proverb because Rohmer actually came up with it himself.
Well, Rohmer loves literature. I mean, he started his career as a French teacher, so it's not very surprising that he would come up with Proverbs when he couldn't find one to express what he wants.
Full Moon in Paris does strike up a pretty startling difference to at least the first 2 films of the cycle, in that it is just exquisitely shot. Now, Pauline at the Beach already started this trend with the beauty of the beaches, but here we are very rarely outside. Most of the shots are in rooms, and it feels so elegant. And it's also worth noting that this is perhaps the most famous lead in all of the films. Art house darling Pascal Augier plays the lead, and she's just absolutely fantastic here. The camera loves her. She brings such elegance to this role.
Yeah, I think it's impossible to talk about that film without talking about her because, of course, the aftermath was that she died like very closely after the film, I think from an overdose. So there's, of course, a lot of tragedy that is tangled with the film. One more thing, Chris, as you talked about the cinematography, I think it's perhaps the most, or one of the most famous cinematographers that Rohmer worked with. Renato Berto, who also shot films with Louis Malle, Dolan Renes, and with Straub and Hulet. So it's maybe not such a big surprise that this film looks so stunning.
Stunning and even calm this film is also masquerades the kind of strange split we see in Louise. Because again, she is someone who, unlike Sabine from A Good Marriage, really just wants to have it all. She seems to love her boyfriend to some extent or another, but she can't be around him. She needs absolutely everything at once. And her need is quite interesting, especially compared to all of the other leads in the series who are looking for love.
Yeah, and one of the quotes in the film, Louise says, "Unlike most people, I can't imagine loving someone who disapproved of me or ignored me." And I definitely felt like when she says most people, it feels like she's referring to the other people in the films in the series. Because in the first three films, many of the characters are seeking someone who disapproves of them or has ignored them.
That's so incredibly true. And in a way, she's essentially the alternate lead in the other films. Like she is the point of obsession, while her boyfriend Remy would more traditionally have been the lead if this film was following the same kind of structure and goal as the three previous films.
Yeah, I agree that she sticks out because unlike the other characters, she's very hedonistic. She struggles with her life the way she conceives of it.
I think, yes, Pascal Augier was perfect for this role because it feels like she's not really acting. We mentioned earlier that she sadly passed away from a drug overdose at 25. So she was someone living at the fullest, let's say. And this is something that we can see in the film, in her character, that she wants to live life as much as she can and not have responsibilities or try to push them as far back as possible from her life. And yeah, for this reason, I think it's a role that was perfect for her.
Yeah, at the beginning of the film, she makes an interesting agreement with her boyfriend where she says, okay, if you find someone else, you go with her, and if I find someone else, I'll tell you and go with him. So basically, they're pleading to be honest and split up if something happens. But Remy, of course, who's maybe a bit obsessed with her, thinks it will never happen, and in a way, she's open to it. And I think, in a way, from the very start, their relationship seems kind of doomed. Like they don't really insert themselves fully in it, or at least Louise doesn't.
Just adding to that, like Remy literally looks dead, especially in some of the early scenes when he sees Louise having fun with other people. He just looks like a ghost. His eyes have these black rings under them. He just looks terrible.
Yeah, when I first watched it, I was a bit curious if it was just me who saw this guy looking absolutely strange with his eyes like rigid with blood and everything, and looking very stale. But it's nice that someone else makes the same observation.
Yeah, I had the exact same observation about Remy. He almost looked ill and lifeless. Leading on from there, I think her friend Octave, for me, was really the least likable character in the entire series.
I mean, it's a very, very weird relationship as well because he's married and he claims to love his wife. We never see her. He never seems to spend much time with her, even though he claims he does. At the same time, he's just lusting after his friend and flirting with his friend and doing all of these very, very strange things, which like, clearly shows that he is severely interested in her, to put it mildly.
Yeah, he relates in a way to Paris Intellectual, which I think he hits in a very interesting way, certainly because it's close to him.
There's also a scene in the restaurant. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to say what happened in it, but he certainly throughout the film seems like he might be trying to sabotage her relationship with Remy.
Oh yeah, definitely. He's essentially the person whispering in her ear, trying to lead her astray a little bit. And obviously, she doesn't really need any help in that department. And she treats him almost a bit like a nuisance, but that's clearly what he wants to do.
Yeah, perhaps he sees Louise a bit as his muse. He's a writer after all, so he might be attracted to the sort of mysterious qualities in her. And I think Pascal Augier portrays, or she has this portrayal when she's on screen that there's something mysterious and unique about her, something knightly, something that might link her to the moon, sort of eroticism, mysticism, and so on.
Yeah, absolutely, yes. I think it's also interesting to notice that I think whenever she's in Paris, it's during the night. And whenever we see her not in Paris, in Logne, where Rémi lives, it's during daytime, usually very early, from what I remember. He doesn't live in a place where much looks like to be happening, and also because he doesn't seem to be the type of person who's feeling comfortable around people at parties. We mentioned earlier how almost sick and pale he looked when he was at a party at the beginning of the movie.
And I think both Pascal Augier and the actor who plays Remy really manages to portray these conflicting auras in a way. The atmosphere between them always clashes. And one of the really interesting things that I mentioned previously is that most of the scenes are set indoors, and often we have simply two characters, or even just Louise, for instance, on a phone, and it works. The tension is there. And in part is the beautiful cinematography and the way everything is just captured, but there's also something in this presence. And it's not claustrophobic for most of it. Like some of the scenes we saw inside, for instance, The Aviator's Wife, it's far more elegant, it's far more tender, but there's still so much passion and life there. You're still drawn into these conversations and into these characters, even though there's so little else happening around them. And this is just so well done by all of the actors involved. And of course, Rohmer, the cinematographer, as well.
Yeah, the intros are very nicely framed in these medium vibes, which sort of gives the characters some place to interact with their surroundings, still to some freedom. I think one of my favorite scenes in the film is actually when Louise is at her apartment in Paris and she's just sitting around on her bed feeling bored, which she previously says, I've never had the chance to be bored before. And so now she wants to experience that. And I think that's so nicely captured, the way she's simply set up there and you sort of feel the boredom in her, which elicits, at least for me, a lot of sympathy to see a character that's bored on screen. I think it's amazing.
It's certainly unusual, yes, I agree. Personally, I think Full Moon in Paris is a least favorite of all the 6 films. It's still a good film, but something just didn't really click with me, I guess. Pascal Augier is obviously very interesting to look at, but I think I would have liked it a bit more if the focus was put on Rémi a little bit more in the film. We could maybe see little bit more how Rémi feels about the situation.
Well, I actually absolutely love the film, and in part because of how elegant and beautiful it is in the presence of Pascal Augier. I think it might feel a little bit lighter on some of the content than the other films, which have far more, shall we say, almost brutal force between the counterparts. Like you said, in this one, Remy is more distant, it's more somber, it doesn't have that punch, but it's just so beautiful to look at. It's so easy to be absorbed in it. And I just think that Pascal Augier brings such a phenomenal presence to the screen that it's almost impossible to look away.
It is quite a unique tale, and it's also very unique for Rohmer. It's a film situated almost entirely at night, which is something you rarely see him do. It's a very interesting dichotomy, and also a very usual dichotomy that Louise is situated in, sort of between adulthood and childhood, or sort of what would you call this, being young and being a bit older, where you can still go out, versus being old and settled. And what I liked so much about it, particularly on the rewatch, was how it's quite melancholic without ever being overtly dramatic, and the atmosphere very much got to me.
Perfect description, Tobias. Melancholic without being too dramatic.
Spoiler warning.
One thing that's really interesting here is that the final act, the climax, if you will, that in each of the previous films were played out as a confrontation between the two counterpoles, plays out a little bit differently here. So in each of the other films, we see a one-to-one meeting in a closed room. And they act their differences out, it's resolved, and they go their separate ways, regardless of the outcome of the relationship overall. Here, this scene actually takes place 4 times. The very first time at the end of Act 1, it's like the film is already completed as we see the strained relationship of Remy and Louise coming to pieces, which is also where they at the end agree to this arrangement. And then all else gone, all suspicions, all of the midsection that we barely dived into. We then get the climax again 3 times. First, with the friend Octave, who in many ways has been the other love interest, if you will, even though Louise obviously never feels anything for him. He comes into her apartment, pushes himself on her, not by force, but just by his words, and really tries to win her over. And this confrontation plays out again exactly the same way as the previous, one trying to push the other out, one trying to leave, and we see that relationship resolved. And then something a bit interesting happens. We get intervals between these. We see Louise meet up with a lover she has just met, cheating on Remy for the first time, her waking up and feeling comfortable with herself, and going to a restaurant and meeting a complete stranger, and they play out this act where they speak about the moon, and they speak about the alignment, they speak about so many things that in many ways reflect Louise's inner life itself. In many words, this third climax is her encountering herself, and then finally, we get the repeat of her conversation with Remy, but now the tables are turned. Because we all remember the compromise that she forced upon Remy, that if he found another woman, he could tell her and leave, and if she found another man, she could tell him and leave. And she never thought Remy would do it. But Remy has met another woman. Remy is leaving her, and this just after her discovering that she actually wants to be with him, that she actually wants to live with him, and she actually wants to make this her life. And it is again, not overly dramatic moment, but it's certainly a somber and melancholic moment.
I don't know if it's truly the decision to stay with Remy, but more a sort of a sudden regret on her part, or having cheated on him, and then her gut reaction is to go back. Whereas I think during the entire film, what she really wants from Remy is stability to that day life, and that's what Remy gives her. But she also wants something more, and she can't have both.
Yeah, in the end, she ended up sadly losing both. Actually, I was thinking about the ending as you were talking, and I think I may have to take back what I said earlier on about the film not focusing enough on Remy. Because now that I think back about it, the final revelation, let's say, is probably way more efficient because we haven't seen him that much. Well, we have this doubt, let's say, when Tav tells Louise that he may have saw someone in a cafe. We didn't really know what happened, if Remy was seeing another woman or not. And now, with the final scene, everything just is revealed in a very brutal way, but they made very efficient because Remy was absent throughout the film. So we could have, like Louise, be, well, maybe it's not what we think, and maybe things will turn out good, but in the end we see that it's real, and sadly it's all over for them.
I think she wanted the best of both worlds by having both houses. And I think when she talked about Remy meeting other women, for example, I don't think she had any expectation that he actually would because he's portrayed in the film as someone who doesn't particularly like going out and doing things. So I think her kind of ideas backfired on her, and she's the one that ends up unhappy. Whereas Remy, who seemed unhappy at the start, seems actually to be happy by the end of the film.
In the final scene, Remy finally looks alive. Like those black bags under his eyes are gone. He looks like a much healthier person, both physically and psychologically.
Yeah, that's true. I think that outlines that in the end, this relationship wasn't very healthy for him either. And it's quite interesting because, in a way, they're quite the opposite in that when Remy finds out that he wants to be with this other woman, he tells Louise pretty much right away when he knows for certain. And I think that ties in a lot to the central conflict in the film, which is commitment, which is something that she doesn't commit to just one thing. She wants, in a way, she wants it all, which is ultimately untenable. And I think this is what makes the character tragic in a way, that she's almost this nightly creature who can't really exist in the day, and she wants, a life full of bliss, of constantly going out. She doesn't want to settle down, and it ultimately doesn't work. And in a way, it's very sad for her. I definitely feel compassion with her situation in the end also.
I also think it's really beautiful the way Rohmer once again bookends it. Just like in Pauline at the beach, the film starts and ends in exactly the same way. And this is something that ties in with all of the previous films in this cycle, which is that every single film essentially starts and ends at the same point. The Aviator's life slightly reaches this, but is more or less aligned. The other three films all match up. In this case, it's a pan towards Louise's home with Remy, and in the end, a pan of Louise walking away. And there are so many tiny touches we haven't even touched upon here, such as this being the first of this cycle that's actually completely segmented into chapters, each by the month they take place in. And one final note, because we talked about this in the previous podcast as well, with trains. When I saw this film at the very beginning, I was so happy to see the return of trains, if you will, and by the fact that we see a train drive by in the distance as the shot pans in towards her home. And this is something we saw in the very first film with our lead always walking from train station to train station and never getting on the train. And then again in A Good Marriage, where the character is always on a train, but we never see her go on or off. And here we just see the train pass her by in a way. It's quite interesting.
I have just two last things to say. First thing I think it's interesting to see that the woman Remy ends up with at the end of the film is a woman he actually met at a party that Louise wanted to go to, and he didn't want it to. So I think it's interesting to see that in a way she's the reason why he ends up with her. And the second thing I wanted to mention is something that Tobias said earlier on when he talked about mysticisms. At the end of the film, they have a discussion about the full moon and how people are influenced by it, because this is something that comes back later on in the next film we will talk about, The Green Ray.
Yeah, and in a way, it's quite similar to a scene in The Green Ray. It's a very nice observation. Maybe one quick thing: faith. She doesn't have faith in one thing. Maybe she has faith in it all. The universe aligning in her favor or whatever. But she doesn't commit to anything really. She wants to have it all at once, and that's why it crumbles.
And both of those final statements are in some way a really good setup of The Green Ray, because in it our lead Delphine doesn't even really know what she wants. In fact, The Green Ray is absolutely unique within the Comedies and Proverbs cycle, whereas each of the other films track relationships between men and women, The Green Ray follows the relationship of one woman to herself. We follow Delphine, who in the very first scene gets a call from a friend telling her she can't join her for their planned vacation. And with this, she has a dilemma. What will she actually do? Who will she actually go on vacation with? What will she do with her summer? Every option, from family to friends, just seemed less appealing. She just can't stay in Paris and she longs for something else. But she's an easy in the suburbs. She's an easy at the beaches. She's an easy even in the mountains. In some ways, she's the complete opposite of Louise, who really wants to have it all and be in Paris. Delphine just wants to get away from Paris, but in a way, it seems like she just wants to get away from herself. But most of all, this film can be seen as an antithesis to the entire series, and perhaps first and foremost, Pauline at the Beach being the second vacation film in the series. And if you do look at that contrast to Pauline at the Beach, which in some ways almost feels perverse, stilted, and sexualized, the nudity in particular feeling almost grotesque and dead, porn always being at the forefront, the Green Ray is in contrast so naturalistic, so light. Delphine is never sexualized at all, unlike Marianne in Pauline at the Beach. And even scenes of nudity do not feel sexualized at all. It simply feels normal. And there's a shockingly impressive reason for this. Every line in the Green Ray is actually improvised. Only the scenarios and the plot progression was set. Even more impressive, Rohmer was experimenting with just how small he can make his crew, cutting it down to, I believe, about 5 people and shooting with a small camera on 16mm film. Like everything stripped completely bare. We follow Delphine from day to day to day. And the proverb is, the time comes where the heart falls in love. And I know this is an absolute favorite for so many of us, so I can take it on to the person who loved it the most of all, Tobias.
A slight correction. It's actually a skeletal crew of only 3 people. So that means Rohmer, his cinematographer, and then a sound recordist, and I guess also a sound designer. So it's like it's shot at the bare minimum, and it's shot, as you said, completely improvised. Much of the script figured out in tandem with Marie Reverie, who plays the lead, who's also credited as the writer here, which is, and in a lot of ways, this is an incredibly unique approach for Rohmer, because he never did anything like this before, and by all accounts, he was quite nervous before shooting it, because it was so improvised. But on the other hand, he also felt quite free with the structure because he had such a small crew, which allowed him a lot of freedom. And of course, any expenses that they had, again, would be quite small, and it allowed for a lot of possibilities. I think what is so remarkable about this film in the end is actually that it's shot almost like a vacation diary.
Okay, so I have a bit of a reputation on here for disliking a lot of the characters in the series. But when it comes to Delphine, I really loved her in this film. For me, she was the most real character. So by this point, you've already seen 4 films. Most of the characters are saying exactly what they want. They're making crazy decisions, they're in relationships where they're unhappy. And then Delphine, for me, in this film, was the only one who wasn't really articulating exactly what she wanted. And, she was very unhappy, but she seemed the most genuine. I think there was a kind of documentary feel to it as well, perhaps because it was improvised. But yeah, she certainly seemed to me like the opposite of many of the other characters in the series. And this ended up being definitely my favorite film of the series.
Yeah, I agree with you, Adam. I think the fact that the film was improvised helped a lot to add to the realness, let's say, of the dialogues and the way we feel about Delphine. Overall, it's my favorite film of the series as well. I think it's a very different film from all the rest, as we said before. It's probably the first film of the series where the main character doesn't have one love interest. She doesn't know what she wants, as we said. She tries to go to places, to the beach, to mountains, to stay in Paris during the summer, but she feels like she's not feeling good wherever she's going. She's looking for something. We can tell that she needs something. Something is not going right in her life, but she doesn't know what it is. And it seems that no matter where she goes and no matter who she talks to, she doesn't feel like she belongs where she is. And for this reason, I think she is a very touching character and character that we feel a lot of, at least I felt a lot of sympathy for. It's a very different character from the rest of the series. Yeah, more sympathetic character, yes. It's really a character that feels very sad and lost, and weak is not the correct word, but she feels insecure about everything compared to all the other characters who seems to want something. They know what they want and they need to get it no matter what. And for this reason, yeah, I think she's probably the most interesting character of the entire series.
I also think there's an absolutely beautiful and interesting contrast with the way she feels and just the way the film is shot. Just the first thing I noticed there was just light. There's just so much light absolutely everywhere. Then we see her sitting and reading, light comes in. She's on the train, light comes in. And I also thought it was a really interesting contrast to the Aviator's wife, where Marie Riviere also played the co-lead, because Delphine essentially lives the exact same life as Anne. She has the same job, office related. She even has the same actors as a friend. And she essentially has the same tiny apartment, but where Anne's apartment was completely dark and shut off from the world, Delphine's is always filled with so much light, and the focus is almost always out the window or the light coming in. This also really feels like a purposeful contrast to her internal life. I mean, inside she's clearly almost screaming, or at least experiencing crippling unrest and loneliness. But all around her, there's light. There's light everywhere. And this just makes it feel so incredibly powerful.
Yeah, I agree, Chris. I think there's a lot to be said about the cinematography simply because it emphasizes so much with her point of view. She gets so much freedom in the film, and the camera constantly follows her, even in a state of complete idleness. Looking at her and by giving her agency in the film, I think we come to sympathize so much with her. That's an interesting point regarding the cinematography because Rohmer wanted to work with an entirely female crew here, and finding a female cinematographer proved quite hard. So in the end, he settled for a 23-year-old cinematographer who had never shot a feature film before, Sophie Mantigny, and she did an absolutely remarkable job by all accounts, often with very simple compositions, but which are incredibly effective. In the end, like this a scene in the film, which is Delphine walking around idly in the fields, and she ends up at a fence. She looks out across the sea, and she looks at the wind going through the leaves in the trees, through the vegetation, and then she begins to cry. It's almost rhythmical in the way it's cut and shot. It's completely remarkable how this film captures nature and captures a lot of situations with a lot of quick cutaways and often very interesting observations that the camera picks up.
I think it's also really interesting that there was only one scripted, quote unquote, scene where she was supposed to cry. All of the other scenes where she cries is improvised, her living her character and bringing all of this tenderness to it. And it just works so incredibly well.
The fact that the dialogues were improvised also added to the feeling that this film is very different, not only from the other film of the series, but also from Rohmer's filmography in general, because he loved writing dialogues and having very precise ideas of what he wanted his actors to say. So it's extremely strange, let's say, to see that he decided on this one to completely turn the table and do something completely different.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. I was reading something from an interview where Rohmer mentions that the Green Ray was originally going to be like an intermediary between the Comedies and Proverbs series. He says like something I regret a bit now is putting it in as part of the series. I'm not sure exactly why he regrets it, but I thought it was an interesting thing because the film does feel a bit different from the rest of the series to me.
Well, he was always considering putting it in. In fact, the other improvised film he did later, he also considered putting in, but in the early working stage, he decided against it. The reason why he regrets it is actually because he had said later that this would have been the perfect summer for his Four Seasons series. And he kept saying that he could never make a better summer. And in fact, the alternative title of this film, which is often used, is Summer, making it really confusing. There's obviously also Rohmer's Summer Tale from the Four Seasons.
He also said that he wanted to finish the series in a more optimistic way, and I think that's certainly something he achieved with the last two films. And the last two films are actually two of my favourites, and I think it's the optimism in them that makes them quite different from the other four.
Another thing that is very unique in this film is that Rohmer explicitly uses fantasy elements in this film, with Delphine randomly finding playing cards on the ground, which, of course, could potentially be, it's not like finding an elf on the open street or a goblin or whatever, but it is quite strange, and it is magical what is happening to her. She finds the first one in a place that's maybe understandable, but then later on she finds it a very strange place. And she's also haunted, or she feels chased by the color green. And then, of course, the title is an allusion to a Jules Verne novel, which is another thing I like so much about the film, that the phenomenon of the green ray is explained to us by a group of old people who Delphine randomly passes by. And this idea of this novel and this idea of this phenomenon of the green ray is implanted in our minds. And maybe we should go into what the green ray is, actually. It's a physical phenomenon. When the sun sets down and when it's just below the horizon and you have an extremely flat horizon, usually it's only possible over sea or desert, that you see a green ray instead of the normal yellow-orange of the sun, just as the last ray of the sun, as the very last one, when the light is broken in this exceptional fashion.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I think magical perfectly sums up the whole film. And it's exactly why probably many of us have it as our favourite film in the series.
Yeah, everyone but me, essentially, but it is still my second favorite of the series, and it's still one of my all-time favorite films.
Sorry, I meant to say everyone with the correct opinion has it as their favourite film of the series, and then Chris, obviously, he's a good host, but he's incorrect this time, unfortunately.
Hey, you used to agree with me about the Aviator's wife, but what can you do?
Yeah, I changed. That's like my second favourite now, but I changed my opinion after this one. Sorry, Chris.
No worries. But I just want to say that one of the reasons why it is so fantastic and why it is so different is there's this one relatively famous Rohmer quote where he tried to sort filmmakers into architects and painters. They called himself an architect, someone who used the space around him very specifically and didn't want to do something else with it. But here, it really feels like he's the painter. You have all of these just delightful, delicious frames all throughout the films, including especially the scenes inside of Delphine's apartment where she might just be leaning back, reading a book. And it's just so beautiful, the way he plays with the light, the way he plays with the colors. I don't think I've ever seen a Rohmer film do this before.
Yeah, I think the 60mm might even add to that. Thing that I particularly admire about the film is because the crew is so small, they were able to just go out and shoot on a crowded public beach. And you get scenes which are quite unique, and that's something that makes this film so lively.
Well, we know how Rohmer didn't like publicity and how he was private about everything he was doing, about his life, and how he didn't like to be recognized in public. I don't know if the other persons on the beach, for example, they knew that a film was about to be shot. It just seems that everything that goes on around is part of real life.
I mean, I really think that the fact that everybody were improvising their lines and reacting to Marie Revere plays into this. I mean, Rohmer even commented on this later that if you give an actor a script, they can really ham it up and break it. But if you let them react naturally, it really, really works. And I want to focus a little bit on the actual improvisation because nobody actually knew what Marie Revere would do. In some cases, the actors were literally pulled off the street as instant replacements. In some scenes, all Rohmer would tell people would be, get her to do this, or ask her about that. And it just creates such electrifying atmosphere. But adding to that, we talked a little bit about how this film is all about Delphine struggling with herself and struggling with her relationship with other people. And I think this improvisation also makes it incredibly awkward. You really feel the tension between her and the other characters on screen, and you can feel the awkwardness, the unease as she's in some of these situations. And that's probably aided by the fact that the people around her just didn't even know what to say, how to react. And it just became something so much stronger, so much beautiful because of this.
Chris, I think what you say ties in a lot with the comedy in the film, perhaps, too, which is very much a comedy of human interaction. When I watched it for the first time, I didn't find it funny at all. I just found it tragic that she was sort of unable to connect with the world around her. But on subsequent viewings, I really found it more and more funny, actually, and which is exclusively based on the characters sort of riffing off of each other.
And for a scene with so much improvisation, it's actually especially impressive that some of the strongest scenes are just of Marie Revere on her own. Just seeing her walk up a mountainside, for instance, or seeing her just walk or sit alone, they're just so powerful. And seeing this film is just shocking and surprising and sad that she never became a great French actress. I mean, she essentially only has major starring roles in Rohmer films, though luckily she is in a decent few others. And while this film is in so many ways sad and somber because we feel with Delphine as a character, I think we also really need to stress what we talked about earlier, that this is really the perfect summer film. Like those scenes on the beach, the light used, the way it's shot, like this really embodies summer, and there are elements of happiness here too. And like this film as a summer film has gone into my mind to such an extent that, you know, if I'm on the beach, this will be the first film that comes to my mind. It just has such a great impact as a summer film. So don't be in any way put off by how somber and sad it might sound.
Yeah, I think perhaps the most involving film about vacations, really, because it takes us right into her central dilemma, which is a very modern one: what to do with my entire vacation.
And it's also just interesting that this film, just like Full Men in Paris, was actually segmented, and in this case, beautifully hand-drawn cards for every single day as the story progresses, and it just moves so smooth and it feels so nice. And as you mentioned earlier, as this summer log in a way, this diary of a summer. But this does lead us to the conclusion and the spoiler section.
Spoiler warning.
Now, as you mentioned in the beginning, there is no actual relationship here. Now, Delphine hasn't actually been with anyone for 2 years, and part of the story is her getting over this love in some way, but that's not really present there. The focus of the story is simply her seemingly unable to love herself, seemingly unable to be comfortable anywhere. And this starts to slightly change when she hears the story about Jules Verne's novel and the Green Ray and what it can do. And it's a really interesting scene because it's the only scene really where the camera leaves her. It just focuses on the group of people talking about the book and talking about the phenomenon, and it stays with them before we again see her as she has absorbed it all. In a way, it starts a feeling of hope, of a magical belief. And this is where it gets a little bit interesting because she goes to a train station. As we talked about previously, trains are a massive part of this series. And for the first time, we see the inside of an actual train station as she sits and waits for a train. And she meets a man. He notices her book. Ironically, she's reading The Idiot. This was completely by chance. The Rohmer said it couldn't have been more perfect. They strike up a conversation, and somehow they come to the conclusion, or actually she invites herself to come with this man, and they simply just for a few hours so they can talk. They sit outside a restaurant, they talk, they bond. In many ways, it reflects the previous films in that it is, in fact, the opposing force in a way revealing itself. It is Delphine talking about herself and opening up, and in so many ways, as opposed to all of the other climaxes throughout this series, it's not the end, it's a beginning, especially as they go up to the top of a hill, sit down on a bench, watch the sea, and actually see the green ray. And Delphine cries, and the film ends. Very open-ended. Has it actually come a time for heart to fall in love. It's beautiful, it's simple, it looks at fate, it looks at her as a person, and it gives the hope that maybe if you just are able to love yourself, love can actually be possible.
I agree, it's a beautiful ending. And something that I noticed the last time I was watching is that Rohmer almost makes us feel suspense about a sunset, which I think, again, is very funny. Yeah, it's just a perfect ending, really.
Yeah, I think the ending scene is my favorite moment in the entire series. And I kind of felt like it was a reward for Delphine. You know, she'd kind of suffered throughout the film. She seemed the most genuine. And I saw it as a kind of reward for her, whereas other characters, most of the other characters didn't end up with a happy ending, but she got one. I can't think of another way to describe it. I just thought it was an amazing ending.
Yeah, I agree with all of you. The ending is a really beautiful scene. Actually, someone else had to film the Green Ray, and from what I read on Wikipedia, it took him about 7 months after the film was made to finally get a chance to film this Green Ray phenomenon. So yeah, I think it's a good thing that the ending is a good one. And I think it's also important to notice that this is also the first film where the ending is not where the film started. Here, she ends up in a completely different place than she was at the start of the film, which completely breaks this circle that we had from the beginning. I think that it shows that she went a long way. She's not where she was at the start. Something really happened to her during the film, and she managed to break the circle and finally lead a different life.
Yeah, so I feel like in many of the films in the series, it's full of characters making huge demands for what they're expecting to have, or having this big illusion about the relationship and how happy it is when it really isn't. And I think Delphine was the only one who was truly being honest with herself about her situation. And I think the ending was basically like nature rewarding her.
I think it's also a nice side note that Rohmer, who was a practicing Catholic, said he was really uncomfortable filming or presenting his faith in any real way, though he obviously dipped into it at a few points, such as Manhattan Mods, but that he loved people who believed in something. And this film, obviously, Delphine finds this faith in the Green Ray. It feels like Rohmer really shares sympathy for this faith, and he also wants to reward it in some way. Tying in with everything that's been said, this is also why it feels like such an antithesis, the entire cycle. It breaks all of the rules, all of the conventions. It's not directly about men versus women. It's about a woman loving herself. It doesn't end in the same way it started. Everything is free, everything is open in so many ways. Watching this, I really felt that this should have been final film. There's so many callbacks throughout, and it releases everything. It gives hope. However, being the antithesis, Rohmer also had to make the final synthesis, and this is where the next film comes in. So, welcome back to all the listeners who did not want to get the Green Ray spoiled. But it is really important to understand the importance of My Girlfriend's Boyfriend by knowing that the Green Ray opened a door to something new and let a conclusion to the cycle, a conclusion to the internal contradictions Rohmer has been exploring so far, possible. And Rohmer plays into it with the most clear and ambiguous metaphor of all, a new city. All of our characters live or work inside of a brand new city just built. It's beautiful, light, open, but empty. This is also where My Girlfriend's Boyfriend promises a new plot, a new story. This time the film opens with two women, Blanche and Leah, meeting for the first time, and we follow as their friendship grows. We also see something that we've never really seen before. Blanche, our main character, is a woman who for the first time actually seems relatively confident and happy. Can a lead in this cycle actually have these qualities? However, we quickly start to see callback after callback to the previous films, including near direct duplications of the relationships or the premises of the first two films. Leia and her boyfriend essentially mirroring the strained and serious relationship in The Aviator's Wife, and Blanche seemingly falling for someone she barely knows and starting to pursue him with the help of Leia, just as in A Good Marriage. So has something changed, or is everything still the same?
Yeah, you mentioned the city it was filmed in, and maybe just before we start talking about the film, it could be very interesting to point out that Rohmer actually shot a documentary about it in the mid-70s, where he traced this development. And now he returns to it to actually, I guess, questioning what kind of life this place facilitates in a way. And the place has almost seemed extremely futuristic to me. There's almost a thin lace of science fiction over it.
Yeah, building on what Tobias just said, just like in The Aviator's Wife, where the park was basically my favorite character, if you can call it that, I think in this film, the best scenes were in the background. So I really like Rohmer's use of setting.
I think you mentioned, Tobias, a very interesting point earlier on when you talked about the city and how futuristic it looks. Didn't really thought about it before you mentioned it. When we look at the previous films, Rohmer shot in Paris. He shot in the old city part in Le Mans. He also shot in a small village. All of these different places are old places that really haven't changed for a long time. So it's interesting to see that the last film of the series takes us to the future in a way, future of architecture, while still keeping a very important place for nature.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. In fact, what you made me think now is that because the place is so new, you almost feel like the characters haven't quite figured out how to live there.
I think that's completely right. And it's also really interesting that see Blanche looking out of her window and the trees haven't even grown yet. It's so bare. Possibly quite unlike the characters, because there seems to be a bit of a change here in this how the characters are presented. They don't seem as heavy, they don't seem as obsessed, they don't seem as constrained as our previous characters. And I think we were talking with Adam before the film, talking about how, once again, these characters was actually a lot easier to like.
Yeah, again, I had a reputation for not liking characters, but in this one I liked them a lot more. And I think the film had a much more fun kind of feel to it. It was a little bit farcical, but it was a fun, kind of lighter atmosphere than the other films. I also wanted to mention that Lucy from The Aviator's Wife makes an appearance in this film as well. So you might not have noticed. I know Chris watched it and didn't notice because she looks quite different in this one. She was in very few films, so it was very cool to see her pop up again. She didn't play a particularly nice character, but it was nice to see her make another appearance.
I think it's also really interesting that in many ways she contrasts her previous character and even plays a bit of a similar role in that she rebel rouses a little bit with the lead, puts some other ideas in her mind, and it's a bit of a joker, but obviously in a very different way. You're also spot on in atmosphere, because that's one of the main things that really separates this from all of the 5 previous films. The atmosphere is actually genuinely light. Just like in The Green Ray, there's so much light here everywhere, but it's not contrasted with internal screaming. It's contrasted with this lighter, more farcical comedy, which is such an interesting change of pace.
What really starts to evolve here after sort of the initial setup is that we have constellation of 2 sets of partners, Blanche and Alexandra, who are almost in a My Night at Maud's kind of relationship where one is after the other, but Alexandra doesn't know anything about it. And it feels kind of contrived in a similar fashion again. And then there's Leia and is his name Pierre? I think it is, who are in a normal relationship. And then after a while of Blanche pursuing Alexandra and nothing quite happened, she slowly gets introduced to Pierre, and Leia sort of starts to say that she's slowly falling out of fashion with him. She has this trip to the holiday where she constantly fights with him about where to go, and then she doesn't want to go with him at all. And then there's suddenly an opening where Blanche and Pierre start to have some chemistry.
I kind of felt like the characters matured as the series went on, and in the last two films they were a lot more mature and easier to like. I also found it quite refreshing in this that the people they were interested in this film seemed a lot more suited to them, whereas in some of the previous films they didn't seem suited at all. So I thought it was a nice conclusion to the series.
I think it was also interesting to see all of these different callbacks to the previous films within these characters. I mean, in a way, Leia encompasses at least 3 of the previous lead characters. Her relationship almost spot on from the Aviator's wife, in that in the very first scene you see him coming after her, him trying to get her along to a party, her completely disinterested, and you see this strained relationship. At the same time, she talks about this great love, great visions for herself, and how she can get it, speaking almost as a child, wanting all of these castles in Spain, bring her over to Sabine. And then you also have this sense of her resembling Louise in that she also wants it all. She wants to have absolutely everything at the same time. While Blanche feels like a lot more of a new character, perhaps even a more matured Pauline or Lucy. But then as the film kind of progresses, we see her far more emotionally insecure. We see her remind ourselves a lot more about, say, Delphine, just looking for love. And then obviously a little bit more Sabine as well, as she starts this strange chase after Alexandra. And I think this is a really fun place to also say the proverb, though we spoil what that means later, but the proverb is, my friends' friends are my friends. And this probably starts to explain a little bit of the dynamics and the more fun dynamics of these 4 characters as they intermix.
Spoiler warning.
Obviously, the proverb here is extremely playful in that Blanche slowly starts to fall for Pierre, and that Blanche develops feelings for Fabienne, and Leia starts suddenly develop feelings for Alexandra. And these relationships just start to switch and intertangle, and it's done in such a playful way, which is very strange for Rohmer, in that there doesn't really seem to be any direct judgment there.
Yeah, certainly. That's essentially, you have a woman's best friend and her partner both cheating on her, and in the end, everything turns out fine, and they all laugh about it, which is very unusual for Rohmer. Though I think maybe there's a more sinister undertone, which we'll talk about in the end. I think something that really evolves as the film goes on is this understanding that both Leia and Alexandra and Blanche and Fabienne as partners, they quite different. They embody perhaps different kinds of characters that we have already seen, or at least there's some similarity where Leia and Alexandra are more hedonistic, more in the moment. And there's even this funny scene where Alexandra talks something about not going out with any other women for 6 weeks, or is it 6 months? I don't entirely remember, but a rather long time, especially for him. And then at the end, he just takes it down to a couple of days. Whereas Blanche and Fabienne are both more constant. They want something lasting, which is also part of what they bond over, this similar approach to life. It's a scene in The Witch, which is, in my opinion, one of the best scenes that Rohmer ever made, because it's simply such a romantic scene where you really feel that these 2 characters are in love, because they suddenly have this amazing chemistry where you really feel what they bond over. And the entire scenery around them just supports it, because it's all lush and green and summery, and everything sort of comes together around this moment. And then, of course, afterwards there's this question, is it all wrong, or is this all right?
So towards the end of the film, Blanche says, I realized that what I loved wasn't a person, but an image. And that's one of my favorite quotes in the film. When I was watching, all I could think was, if only the other characters in the other films could realize that. I also wanted to say that, not really adding much to the discussion, but Fabienne would be my favorite male character in the series. And I think they were a really nice couple, in contrast to some of the really dysfunctional relationships we saw in the other films as well. I think the quote I just mentioned coming in the final film is significant, because I'm kind of focusing on the idea that the characters are matured throughout the series. And Delphine, got happiness. In this film, the characters get happiness. They're having realizations that the other characters simply didn't have at all.
Well, actually spot on there, Ed. I mean, in a way, just kind of cracked the entire series in that each of the other films, barring The Green Ray, which was Delphine struggling with her feelings for herself, all of the characters are longing for someone who's just not that interested in them. And in this film, Blanche realizes that she was never even interested in Alexandra. There's nothing there. And this also starts to tie us over to the end of the film, where all four of these characters manages to match up with someone who does fit them, just as to be assessed. These are obviously two previous matches that weren't made for each other, and they actually found someone who in many ways are perfect for them.
Yeah, it relates very interestingly to a famous work by Goethe that Rohmer probably knows, Elective Affinities, where he wrote a novel essentially based on the concept of love and human relations as chemical interactions, where two couples meet and then they swap partners based on a partner simply fitting better than their current partner. And this is in a way also what we see here. There's an element of ease to it. And this is very strange for Rohmer. Like, what is his opinion on this? A lot of his films is more of a Catholic moralistic stance on, what about the institution of marriage? And it's also very interesting that Rohmer, who seems to be obsessed with marriage almost, he would have the opportunity to make such a film about married people, but he didn't. No one in this film is married, and this sort of a weird free-spiritedness about it.
I think you hit on something really important there, Tobias, and this should take us on to the final scene of the film as well, which in all of the previous films, including The Green Ray, has been this confrontation. There's always, in the final act, there is a confrontation between the counterpoles. They clash. There's a scene in a closed room. Now, obviously, something happened in The Green Ray with the openness and the acceptance and the ability to build something new, which means that here, at the end, there actually aren't any counterpoles. The situation has actually been resolved. The contradiction has been resolved. The two mismatched couples has rearranged themselves perfectly. And this contradiction just doesn't happen. Instead, we essentially just get a farce. We get a confusion where Leah feels guilty for being with Alexandra, who she thinks Blanche is in love with, while Blanche is obviously really destroyed about having gone behind Leah's back and sleeping with her boyfriend. They meet up and they have this just confusing situation where one believes they're talking about the other's boyfriend, and it just resolves the joke when you realize that's not the case, and everything resolves happily, and all of these four characters just sit down at the table, they talk, they smile, and they depart as friends. And in a way, this is not just the resolution to the entire series, but you can even call it a contradiction upon the moral tales as well. Because all of the moral conventions are broken. They cheated, and they were happier for it.
Well, given the personalities of some of them, especially Alexander, I'm not sure their relationship will last that long, but at least at the end of the film, they seem to be happy with each other. A thing I noticed about the ending, obviously intentional, was the color of the shirts that they were wearing. Blanche and Alexandre are wearing a green, while Léa and Fabien are wearing a blue shirt. So I thought it was a nice touch. And actually, when I saw that, I went back through the film and took a piece of paper and a pen and started writing down at every point the color of the shirt they were wearing. And I spent maybe like 20-25 minutes trying to find links and connection. Sadly, I couldn't find any connection, but it would have been fun if I could find any. And maybe if someone does that, maybe they will find something I missed. But yeah, I thought it was a nice touch to add, and something that made me want to rewatch the film to spot little details I would have maybe missed.
That's absolutely fantastic initiative and engagement, Clem. And it's even a little bit fitting and believable that Rohmer could have done this, because one of the things he actually did in this series was that for each film, he picked two specific colors and played with them, which he would also use in the posters later. So it's just really interesting that he always kept colors in mind, even though you couldn't find that magical key you were looking for.
Yeah, the colors of their shirts and dresses, I think, is something you can't quite unsee once you've seen it. Essentially, what I feel like is going on, it gets a bit convoluted because there's so many scenes where the colors swap, but it always revolves around blue and green, with particularly Leia and Blanche always wearing, one of them is wearing blue, the other's wearing green. And I think the obvious analogy to this drives towards is that they swap their partners like their clothes almost, because at the very start, I'm quite sure they're actually wearing the opposite color that they end up with, and that these pairs are color matched in this way, which is somewhat of a sinister comment. It almost feels like Rohmer sort of finds a hole in this happy fantasy at the end. Like, you can certainly discuss what perspective wins out, which I think is really, really open. Or I would lean more towards saying it's somewhat of a happy ending, but he sort of points in this direction that maybe this is all vanity and they change their partners like their clothes.
Really great observation as well, to be honest, because this really ties into how Rohmer always makes his film. Even though he has these central contradictions, he always loves to play with minor contradictions of every single interpretation you might have. So the fact that he always adds a counter idea to this happy ending, this beautiful, almost fairy tale ending, has a fakeness to it and won't necessarily work. I think that's also a perfect interpretation and something that's quite worth considering.
This is a really interesting dichotomy that Rohmer plays with in the end, sort of them swapping partners because. And then, of course, the implications that all of this came about by cheating and by being quite easygoing about what happened, which is, as we previously said already, quite a counterpoint to what he previously detailed in his films, where he portrayed such a behavior much more as amoral, and he is much more open, sort of, what exactly the values are that we should attribute to it. Because I think ultimately, at least, Blanche and Fabienne come out of it quite well. They're not portrayed particularly negatively at all, and they do seem like a very good match. So there's perhaps not so much that ultimately speaks against it. Yes, it's interesting that Rohmer counterbalances this light and easygoing rom-com atmosphere. This is maybe the lightest film he made up to that point ever, and then he counterbalances this with this sinister, sarcastic metaphor by switching partners like clothes. Imitation of Life or something. They were hollow, moralistically weren't really. They were hollow as humans. I express myself weirdly, but I think it's quite clear what I mean.
It's also really interesting combination of what we talked about for such a long time in the beginning, which is just about this new, really artificial and empty city. So there are even more counterpoints interacting here. I think it's also really fascinating that as the love between Fabienne and Blanche grows, like a lot of the scenes where they bond are out in nature as well. They're in bright, beautiful light, and we just never see or feel Rohmer judge them. In fact, it's Blanche who's really serious about this and feels horrible about betraying Leia and brings all this morality into it. And it's only really when Leia and Fabienne breaks up and that she sees he's free that she truly goes for it. Before that, she was feeling so terrible about everything she had done. But in that way, too, it's also just coming over her own morality, which is the interesting counterweight to the moral tales, in that by overcoming her morality, the same with Leia, she felt really uncomfortable being with Alexandra because it felt like she was betraying Blanche, that by overcoming their own morality, which perhaps was quite light and frivolous, not really based on the best outcome for any of them, they got a happy ending.
Yeah, in a way, it seems like a dichotomy almost between nature and society, where the societal obligations is what leads them to consider, oh, is this cheating? But really, with the interaction between Blanche and Fabienne, it all seems quite honest, and they don't play those societally induced love games of, say, Pauline at the beach. They actually seem to completely honestly fall in love with each other. And maybe this is ultimately why Rohmer lets him off the hook so easily, because he has this immense adoration for nature. And perhaps he sees in this relationship between Blanche and Fabian something quite natural playing out and something honest, where they end up going all in, which I think is a quality he admired in his characters before.
Also, as we've been talking about trains throughout all of this, I think it's really important to also add that we do see the characters in train stations here, and in a different way from other films, we actually see them go into train stations as they are taking a train and go out of train stations as they are leaving the train. We never actually see them leave the train themselves or on the train. So we can speak a lot about what trains have meant throughout this entire series. Obviously, they're used differently in every single film. Even in Pauline at the Beach, where a train is never shown, Marianne takes a train off screen. So it's just really interesting that these characters who get the happy ending are actually the people we see go into train stations and leave train stations, completing their journey.
I think it's also interesting to notice that just like in the Green Ray, the circle is also broken, and the characters do not end up where they were at the beginning of the film.
And to sum up the entire cycle as well, because we really did see a complete dialectic here, where we start off with a man obsessed with a woman, then saw a woman obsessed with a man. We saw a young girl observing the love games of the adult and coming face to face with the oldest man, essentially embodying all of male perversion. And then we started to get contradictions to the above, whether or not you can run away and have everything at once, before we then saw the complete antithesis in the Green Ray, with Delphine coming to love herself, and finally, as Adam pointed out earlier, in My Girlfriend's Boyfriend, the characters realizing that what they were actually loving was an image, resolving all of this and actually ending up finding love. And in such a way, even though there's so many contradictions throughout each film, we essentially see Rohmer resolve the contradiction of love, and to show that to find it, you have to love yourself, not chase after images. And at that point, you can actually open yourself up to finding someone you can genuinely love and be with.
And how uniquely contemporary his settings are, and how he circles around this large host of characters with all these different problems that are really, perhaps in a lot of ways, quite similar. And the films offer a reflection of all of these characters and their preoccupation with other things. It also explores, especially in this last film, a modern idea of what is romantical love, where does it exist in the modern world. And of course, it constantly seems to ask this question, do I have the right partner? Again, especially in the last film. And also perhaps it asks the question, or it portrays rather, all the self-deception that is involved in this quest for love.
I think it's also really interesting that Rohmer didn't actually know if this was the final film or not. We could have gotten more from this series. Though I think that the experience of making the Green Ray really made Rohmer interested in going other places, and that the only reason he in some ways made My Girlfriend's Boyfriend was because this was the one film he, interestingly enough, knew he wanted to place in this series from the beginning. Like many of the earlier films, this was a script he had written long ago, which I suppose means that he also saved it, knowing that it would fit so perfectly here. But if he had made more, what could we actually have seen? How would the story have evolved?
Yeah, maybe just as you said, that he definitely wanted to make this. Quite funny to note that My Girlfriend's Boyfriend actually ended up being, together with Full Moon in Paris, it's the most successful film in the cycle, and it's easy to see why, simply because it's such an accessible and romantic film. I think another thing that goes very much through this entire series is his interest in urban planning and modern lives. Places where they live, they seem to emit some, this sounds harsh, but almost some sense of dread. There seems to be some kind of flight, some kind of escape to a simpler way of life.
Just to conclude, yeah, it's interesting to know that Rohmer didn't knew if this film would be the last from the cycle. And I think it's an interesting exercise to take the other films of his filmography to see if they could fit in this cycle, where they would, and if they did, the proverb Rohmer would have come up with. Because Rohmer's films are always very similar while being very different from one another, which is a part of his genius. So yeah, it would have been interesting to see what kind of other film you could have made, and it would have been great to discuss them here.
Yeah, I just wanted to say I'm really glad we have the podcast, and that made me rewatch the films. I think I got a different appreciation from watching them a second time and from hearing everyone else's opinion on the films. It actually makes me want to watch them again, having heard all the observations. Also, thanks again to Chris for hosting this and all the editing that he's done. And looking forward to coming back on in a couple of weeks. Mighty Sparks will be on as well to talk about setting up the forum. So thanks, guys.
It's been absolutely wonderful to go through these films and to discuss them leading up to this podcast and to see all of these tiny details. The most interesting of which being these trains, which I'm almost obsessed about now, just seeing how he used trains differently in each and every film. And just to close this off, I think that if he ever had made a final film, what would have been interesting would have been to see someone go into a train station, get their ticket, go on the train, take that train journey, and get off at their final destination. That would be the only way to really bookend all of this. But all that aside, I think My Girlfriend's Boyfriend is an incredible finale. And what's so interesting here is that you all pointed out how light it was and how it became such a hit on its own. And if you simply see this film, it would probably feel like a very light fare from Rohmer. But because it is the final film in this series, and because it is the resolution to everything we have seen, it just becomes so much more powerful. So if you are listening to this and you either haven't seen the films or haven't seen them in a while, I would just like to say, please watch them in chronological order and see how they play with each other, because that way you truly get so much more out of them. Thank you for listening, and join us again soon. You have been listening to Talking Images, the official podcast of icmforum.com.